I'll give an introduction of Dr. Gloster. Dr. Gloster is the Vice Provost for Graduate Research and the Dean of the Graduate College at North Carolina A&T State University. He received his BS and MS degrees in electrical engineering from North Carolina A&T and the PhD degree in computer engineering from North Carolina State University. In 2019, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame for North Carolina State University's Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. Dr. Gloster?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am elated to have the privilege to moderate this Dean's panel here today. We have my colleagues who are deans of colleges of engineering, as well as deans of graduate schools. And we're going to have a conversation, if you will, around efforts at the dean's level within their institutions and throughout the country to have a positive impact in increasing the representation of minorities in engineering. I would like our deans, as I call on you, to start with your opening statement. And as a part of your opening statement, can you please introduce yourself as a part of your opening statement? And so let's start our conversation with Dean Preselfannie E. Whitfield McDaniels from Jackson State University.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I see I've been called by my government name. Thank you, Dr. Gloster. So good afternoon. I'm Christephanie Mcdaniels, professor of English and Dean of the Division of Graduate Studies at Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. I'm entering my 23rd year at Jackson State and my 4th year as graduate dean. And I'm really happy to have been invited to participate in this panel discussion. So thank you again for the invitation, Dr. Gloster, and for my JSU colleague, Dr. Kamal Ali as well. So let me get on to discussing my perspective on the very important topic at hand. And I know that we're probably going to say a lot of the same things, so I'm glad to be going first. So we're all aware and we're all registered for and presenting during this workshop because women and underrepresented and underserved minorities remain poorly represented in STEM academic programs and on college and university faculties, despite the increases in their numbers over the past 50 years. According to a 2021 article by Stockard, Rolfing, and Richmond, I'm quoting, the representation of those who identify as underrepresented and underserved minorities, also, this is including African Americans, Latinx, and Native Americans, has also increased, reaching 22% of bachelor's degrees and 12% of PhD degrees awarded in 2016. These percentages, however, are far less than their representation within the US population, give or take 30%. Moreover, representation in faculties at research-intensive colleges and universities has remained lower and that would be expected given the number of PhD recipients. So by 2016, only a little more than 1/4 of tenure-track professors at the assistant and associate ranks in top-ranked departments were women, and substantially fewer, 6%, identified as underrepresented and underserved minorities, ending the quote. Here at Jackson State, Kafori stated this in 2021 in an article he wrote. Nearly 40 years of initiatives and policy shifts focused on diversity and inclusion have resulted in a notable increase in the enrollment of underrepresented groups and in colleges and universities. This has prompted many institutions of higher education to actively recruit underrepresented groups. Consequently, participation of underrepresented groups in STEM disciplines have seen a significant rise because of policies and initiatives targeting broader participation. Initially, the primary goal was to, of course, increase enrollment and participation in STEM, and to enhance graduate enrollment, specifically aimed at bridging to the professoriate. Unfortunately, the increase in the diverse enrollment does not match the number of doctoral graduates that we've seen in the same time span. This is also apparent when we examine numbers associated with the recruitment and retention of that underrepresented faculty and administrators in STEM education as well. I say that by looking at some of our own numbers in our College of Science, Engineering, and Technology. So we say this is where we find ourselves. So then the question becomes, what are we doing at Jackson State in particular to address the situation? So the Division of Graduate Studies works hand in hand with STEM programs in the following endeavors. So we outline some of our aims as continuing to adopt curricular alignment measures designed towards broadening participation, the development of skills and competencies to meet the cultural and interest needs of the students we're trying to attract. We hope to provide professional development that supports the faculty as they engage in transforming STEM faculty teaching and mentoring practices. We hope that we're assisting them in designing personalized student mentor research experiences and products, including high impact publication opportunities and personalized research projects, depending on which level the student finds him or herself. And also that we are supporting the creation of intentional research teams and effective mentoring spaces. Because then I say spaces because we know mentoring looks different depending on the needs of the student as well. So then that's what we're hoping that we're doing in graduate studies to support the efforts that we find in our STEM programs. So what is our faculty doing then? So at Jackson State, our STEM faculty who are housed in the College of Science, Engineering, and Technology are working to increase the numbers of underrepresented groups via funded programs that reach prospective students early on. Examples of some of these programs are our Lewis Stokes, Mississippi Alliance for Minority Participation, or the LSM AMP program, the BD program, which is the Bridge to the Doctorate. And it's designed, of course, to broaden participation of underrepresented minority students in STEM disciplines who are at the university. We're looking at providing them with the funding that they need so that it removes those funding barriers. And we also hope that the program then works towards discouraging that student's hesitancy about pursuing graduate degrees in STEM as well. And that program has actually been funded since 2006 with 75 graduates actually. On the other end of the spectrum, our STEM faculty works hard to attract underrepresented groups to undergraduate STEM programs as early as their middle school and high school years. Some of those program examples include the middle school STEM summer camp with Verizon, the Mississippi Summer Transportation Institute, summer programs for grades 9 through 10, the Unite Pre-Engineering Summer Program for rising 9th grade students, and also on this level, our LSM AMPS program has the STEM Academy for 12th graders. And our STEM faculty also work to maintain funded programs at the undergraduate level. Once we've attracted them into our STEM programs as undergraduates, there are programs like the Scholar Academy programs that contains the STEM Aristocrats, which is a summer program for incoming first year college students, and then the Research Initiative for Scientific Enhancement, or the RISE program, which is funded by NIH. So those are some of the things that our faculty are doing, and also some of what we hope we're doing to support them from the graduate studies level. I'm not sure, is my time up now? Okay, all right, I thought so. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. And so now I'd like to present Dean Dana Williams from Howard University.
Thank you, Dr. Gloster, and good to see you, colleagues, and I'm happy to know that there are those of you on listening here. My name is Dana Williams. I am Dean of the Graduate School at Howard. I served as interim dean for a year and a half before being appointed dean recently. And before that, I was chair of the Department of English. So ironically, you have two humanities deans talking about STEM topics here. And then, of course, Preselfannie and I also have the shared background of LSU. I've been at Howard for 20 years, but before then I taught at LSU when Preselfannie was finishing up her dissertation. So glad to be here with everyone. I want to shape my comments here more broadly, in part because, as Dr. McDaniels indicated, we are all thinking about these things in a similar way. So rather than well, one of the ways that we thought about trying to avoid repetition would be to come at it from a different perspective. So I'm thinking about it with broad strokes around what we think the value of an HBCU and a place like Howard is, especially to promote different kinds of models to think about STEM education. And we really have shaped these around three questions. The broad topic, kind of why we can't wait, the push towards racial equity in graduate studies in the US is, again, something that I've been thinking about, but also thinking about from the perspective of STEM. So those three big questions, if you will, and I'll just touch on each of them, and we can talk a little bit more about all of them later. The first one, in what ways are we promoting cultural sovereignty? And so those are the questions that we're asking ourselves at Howard, but that we're also inviting other people to ask at their schools, because we know that all students aren't attending, and overwhelmingly the majority of students who are earning STEM degrees who are of color are earning them in spaces where they aren't necessarily the minority, but then in other instances, they are minorities in PWI spaces. So we're trying also to push folks to think about in PWI spaces and MSI spaces equally, in what ways are we inherently promoting cultural sovereignty, whether we know that we're doing that or not. And we're clear that at the root of the American higher ed system is a kind of fidelity to Western standards. And Dr. Tolson's talk, which I was glad to be able to sit in on, even as he's my colleague at Howard, we seldom get a chance to just like squat and be intellectual folks together. So the way that he was thinking about Ubuntu as concepts to push us outside of fidelity to Western standards really speaks to this question of promoting cultural sovereignty. This is relevant in STEM, most especially when we think about the ways that we are automating racism and really kind of cultural sovereignty with the way that we program systems. And we know that when people who are our minorities are in the room, they're trying to avoid that. But we have to figure out ways that not only are we avoiding it because we aren't always in the room, but how do you advance that in STEM education so that we aren't seeing the things that we see, everything from the racial biases and cultural biases in AI, but then also decision-making software in hospitals that show racial and gender biases. So when you think about how you uncritically adopt the Western platform of scientific inquiry, that's based primarily, if not exclusively, on a white male's knowledge acquisition and knowledge production, you really want to think about very consciously, how do we introduce to people of color, to African Americans very especially, the well-documented scientific achievements of Africans from societies from classical Africa all the way to the contemporary moment. Seems kind of simplified, right? In the sense that we know that it's much more dynamic than you are what you see. And very often, even at Howard, our African-American students especially aren't necessarily seeing African-American faculty in the numbers that we would hope. But part of what we have to do is to recruit more people to be a part of the professoriate, and then encourage people who aren't necessarily in those groups to show people that the default learner is not a white male. The second big question, in what ways are we reproducing homogeneity? Because you can reproduce whiteness in Black spaces, in brown spaces, if you aren't culturally sensitive in certain ways. And so what we try to do at Howard, and then what we try to show other people how to do, and certainly try to promote, is to think about ways to avoid homogeneity culturally and really nationally, racially, and in terms of gender as well. We don't want to have, all of our representative thinkers look alike or think alike. And we have heard many times outside of STEM that, Black and brown communities aren't monolithic, but how do we make sure that our tenured faculty are unreservedly open to avoiding reproduction of themselves? And so that goes back to that challenge that we have, where if you are going to recruit people who look like you, who think like you, then we have to avoid the representation of homogeneity. And I can say a little bit more about it a little bit later, but let me move quickly to the third question. What opportunities exist to decenter whiteness and its surrogates? Where can we do this work very intentionally, not coincidentally? And even as we may do it naturally in certain spaces, we also have to be conscious of the way that we're doing it and intentional about how we can model that for other people. Because everybody, and I say this, jokingly, but realistically at the same time, everybody can't teach at Howard. Everybody can't teach at North Carolina. Everybody can't teach at Jackson State. So how do you create models that, as we're beginning to think about ways that we can expand racial diversity in other spaces, how do we help people understand that this act of decentering whiteness is something that they have to do intentionally, and it's much more than just having Black faculty and Black students, and just in terms of kind of informal ways to interact with each other. I was talking to a colleague in chemistry in preparation for this and saying, like, how do we really think about the way that race manifests in coursework, in assignments, in PhD programs, whether at a PWI or in Black spaces. And he talks a little bit about how something as innocuous as, grabbing a beer after class, where you begin to have discussions about what you're doing in the lab, facilitate certain kinds of conversations. So there's a social element that is also necessary and present for us to think about how do we socialize group think in class spaces so that it doesn't have to happen exclusively on the outside. I'll stop there, but the idea here, I hope, is very clear, is that we have to be intentional about lifting up those models that we know work and being very clear that our vision is to expand in all of the spaces where we are, expand the way that we think about who is the ideal STEM student, who is the ideal STEM professor, what are the ideal kinds of projects and ways of thinking and being in the world that have to do with all of the different areas of STEM that we're covering.
Thank you very much, Dean Williams. And now we transition, if you will, from the deans of graduate schools at two institutions to our two deans of engineering. And so I'd like to turn it over at this time to Dean Oscar Barton Jr. from Morgan State University.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gloster, and I want to thank NSF and the panel for allowing me to share some of my conversations and opportunities to expand diversity and to promote inclusion and equity as a framework for workforce development. So this is I'm completing my first year as Dean at the Clarence M. Mitchell Jr. School of Engineering, joined during the pandemic. And I think I could share with all my colleagues here that they would agree with me that this first year as a pandemic year and joining as a Dean clearly qualifies me to be a seasoned Dean. So there's a ratio I understand that happens, one year for a number of years of experience. I am a product of HBCUs. My undergraduate was at Tuskegee University, and my PhD and master's degree were obtained at Howard University. And if you notice the institutions, they really framed the conversations between how African Americans should be educated. Dueling philosophies from Booker T. Washington that suggested we should be educated from a artisan framework, and at Howard, W.E.B. Du Bois, who suggested we need to be thinkers. And so I had that well-rounded perspective on my educational career. I began my academic career at U.S. Naval Academy, where I rose to the rank of department chair in the ME department. And as a way to provide opportunities for our students, especially African-American female students, we had to capture strategies that will promote their success through our program. So we accredited programs at the undergraduate level in general engineering and started a new program in nuclear engineering. Then moved to George Mason, where I created the ME department there. And in the 6 years since at Mason, we were able to grow the faculty to 18 faculty members and just over 430 students. And then, as I mentioned in June of last year, I was selected become dean at Morgan State, which I'm extremely happy about. We seem to be answering this question over and over and over again. And I knew the lawns guy was going to come cut the grass as soon as I got on. We seem to be answering this question over and over and over again. Why is diversity important? And why is diversity important in engineering? And I give you a simple response. The future of engineering depends on it. And in fact, the future of our society depends on having a diverse and inclusive populace. And some are so questioning what the definition of diversity is, and it's simply embracing differences. And those differences will lead to a richer conversation that all will be had if we include this as part of our framework. We've looked at diversity from many, many perspectives, from a legal perspective, from an economic perspective, and now we're at the framework of discussing it from a social justice perspective. You probably recently heard in the news that Morgan State, along with its three companion universities, Coppin State, Bowie State, and University of Maryland Eastern Shore, recently settled a coalition's case against the state of Maryland that was centered around program duplication, which impacted enrollment for our students. So that legal perspective recognizes that this lens should be used as a way to answer this question about the importance of diversity. Colorado, the governor of Colorado just now banned legacy preferences and admission practices. Why is this important? Legacy practices and preferences really promote an adoption of those who are more wealthy, less diverse, and negatively impact those who are underrepresented and come from a lower socioeconomic background. The economic lens is clear. Our corporate partners have been speaking loudly, and they want a diverse workforce, not only for the value-added proposition of getting the best design, but offering a sense of sensitivity from many perspectives in their workforce. How can we ensure this? Just saying the words really doesn't ensure that it's going to happen. But we've noticed that from our corporate partners, there have been more high-level commitment, definitely from the CEO or the C-suite, all the way down through the project director and project manager level, not just by words or statements, but policies and procedures to back those words up. There has been a more sustained effort to ensure that the workplace is cultural. Okay, it's going to take a while. This is not an overnight endeavor. Why is that important? That's going to drive retention and persistence for our students, who more than likely, and our graduates who are more than likely going to be the first or one of many in that environment. They're promoting affinity groups so that there's a more inclusive environment for our graduates in which to work. And we can't do anything unless we know what we're doing. I'll share an example with you. While I was at the U.S. Naval Academy, our superintendent used the phrase quite often, we graduate the best and the brightest. And he was at a regional conference with other university heads. And one gentleman just happened to walk up to him casually and said, well, sir, you mentioned you have the best and the brightest. And he said, how do you know? And our superintendent was blindsided. The words have been said many, many times. He didn't have concrete evidence. So companies now are looking for ways to monitor their progress towards diversity and inclusion. And those metrics are going to be important for them to answer that key question: how are they building this diverse experience for our students? From the lens of social equity and social justice, the murder of George Floyd, the onset of COVID-19 really opened and shared that our fabric of inclusiveness and diversity is quite fragile. And it does affect the wellness and the efficacy of our students, which we all know that those are two of the elements that drive towards success and graduation of our students. And it's surprisingly, and not surprisingly, it's nice to know that NSF is beginning a program that focuses on racial equity in STEM education. So from the perspective of a legal or legislative perspective, from the lens of an economic perspective, and finally from a social justice perspective, these are all questions and lenses that we have to say that this is a no-brainer. Diversity is where we need to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Barton. And our final dean, Dean Stephanie Adams, Dean of the University of Texas at Dallas.
Thank you, Dr. Gloster. Very rarely I get to call him Dr. Gloster, so we always are Clay and Stephanie. I'm delighted to be here and join my fellow colleagues. Just a little bit as following suit, my background. So Clay and I actually met as students at North Carolina A&T. He was a little bit ahead of me, but I laugh and say he was 4 and I was 2, so we're pretty close in age. I received my bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. I then went on to the University of Virginia to pursue my master's degree in systems engineering. And then I went to Texas A&M to pursue my PhD in interdisciplinary engineering with a concentration in industrial engineering and management. I have been primarily at predominantly white universities most of my academic career. So I spent time at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Virginia Commonwealth, Virginia Tech, and ODU. And now, as Clay said, I'm at UT Dallas. Not that I can't keep a job, I just kind of moved up each time. So some people are able, like my friend Dana over there is able to stay somewhere 20 years, and some of us have to kind of go out to go up. But I remain very passionate about my HBCU experience and have built some programming through my relationships with the institutions that I have been at with a number of the HBCUs as a way to build a bridge for access. My colleagues have talked extensively and very robustly about why diversity is important. So, I mean, I don't have anything really new and novel to add there, but I will just take a moment to pause and talk about what I see as some of the inherent systemic university problems that we have. And I was glad I was able to join and hear Dr. Tolson as he talked about some of the work that President Biden is doing around the HBCUs and other MSIs as well. You know, and I see that my dad's on here. One of the things that I didn't understand for many, many years when he got excited about some of the accomplishments of myself and some of my colleagues at predominantly white universities, it's because historically we were not able to go to some of those institutions. And so they were not designed for us. And so now that we're here, if you build something on a faulty foundation, at some point you're going to have some cracks, right? And so when I think about some of the systemic problems and I think it's not only in our individual institutions, but with our collective thinking about higher education, there's been this sort of notion, well, we gave you, $100 million, you should be happy, but $100 million doesn't equate to hundreds of years of non-existence or poor support if there was existence. And so I think there's still a lot of systemic things that are happening that are barriers to our Black and Brown scholars in all disciplines, but it's even worse and more catastrophic in the STEM disciplines, because every day you look at something and it's a new technology, it's a new way to do something, and we're often not at the table. And so it's very, very important that we do that. I was on a call last week with some folks from NSF, and one of the slides that they showed that I think it's important for our students to know, between 2015 and 2019, they surveyed all the folks who got PhDs in science and engineering, and 8 of the 12 bachelor's degrees that produced those PhDs were HBCUs, right? And they were only talking about Black PhDs in this particular statistic, so I'm not sure what the Hispanic numbers might look like, but I mean, that's pretty significant to say that, 8 out of 12 and the top 3 or 4 were pretty much all HBCUs, and yet we're still not getting our fair piece of the pie, if you will. So I think we really do have to continue to have discussion and advocacy around the importance of this systemic change that needs to occur. And I think as we get into some of the questions around, what deans can do and others can do, that's important. And one of the things that I specifically am doing, and you can think about impacting your own campus, or you could think about impacting in a more collective way. Again, going back to that notion of Ubuntu that Dr. Tolson talked about. So one of the projects that I'm really excited about that's coming to a close, but we've got a new grant that started that's been funded by NSF, is our Dissertation Institute project. Because in order for us to start seeing more Black faculty, and I think about my time at a HBCU, so at North Carolina A&T, the 4 years or 4.5 years that I was there, in engineering, I had one US-born Black professor. And when I would think about physics, I had one Black female physics professor. When I think about math, I had maybe 3. So I think at each math class, I had a different professor. So we need to, and we talk about what's going to help students. They need to see us in the representation. And if they're not seeing us in the classroom, then it's very difficult for them to see themselves. So I think that this project that we have is trying to help our Black and Brown students be able to complete their dissertations in timely manners, and then begin to prepare them for, I'm hoping, careers in the professoriate. But so I think there's some systemic problems is what I'm going to offer as barriers, and I'm going to close there so we can get into some discussion with the questions that were sent. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. This is the point of the panel session where we get to engage our panelists with questions. And prior to this workshop, we had a group of students who are engaged in the workshop who gave us a few questions to ask our panelists. And I would encourage our participants to enter your questions in the Q&A while our panel addresses a few of our student questions so that we could sort of have them queued up to ask in the order of submission. And so let's start with the first question from our students. And any panelists can feel free to jump in. Question 1 is, what are some practical resources and programs that will help graduate students succeed in their courses?
I can lead off on that one, Clay. So I think some of this is going to be individually institutional specific. So, but I think there is a collective set of resources that are available. So, every school has a graduate school. They usually have, some programming support, some orientation support that can help students to find their way. So I think that's important. Each department should have a graduate student, director or some advocate for graduate students who are thinking broadly about graduate education and making sure that students are exposed. But some of us are on campuses where we have an LSAMP, a Bridges to the Doctorate, an AGEP. So these are acronyms that are germane to NSF. So the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation. AGEP is the Alliance for Graduate Education in the Professoriate, and then Bridges to the Doctorate. So there are lots of different kinds of programs like those on many of our campuses. Many campuses also have future faculty programs where students can go and maybe take a couple of extra courses around teaching and teaching excellence and managing classroom and come away with a certificate that prepares you. But in the process of whether you're going to go into the professoriate or not, the preparation and the exposure that you get through some of these programs are also the same things that help us be successful when we run into an obstacle, because we know that there's a support system there for us. So I think that was what I was wanting to offer to that particular question.
Anybody else want to follow up with the same question.
Yeah, I'll add there, Clay. I was just bouncing off of what Stephanie just said with AGEP, BD, LSMM. So we're used to hearing some of the same acronyms. So we've been kind of looking at our strategic plan moving forward at the college level and also at the university levels. And so, you know, that gives you a lot of time to reflect very introspectively on what is needed. So we also reached out to our students through our Graduate Student Association too, for more responsiveness from our students about what they need and what they think we need to be looking at. So we were just coming up with lists of things that we know that we need to either reshape, develop, enhance, and so forth. Workshops on GRE preparation, interviewing skills, looking at patents and intellectual property and those processes, having a curriculum vita that represents you well, looking at what's the difference between undergraduate level writing and graduate level writing. What does pristine research documentation look like, you know, so that you get noticed for your writing skills, how to beef up that graduate application personal statement or research plan, equity statements, and also even training for our faculty on writing the winning recommendation letter that supports the student when he or she is applying for funding for fellowships and so forth. So those are some of the things we've been talking about, along with, and we never get away from, of course, what does real effective mentoring look like?
Dean Barton or Williams, you want to take a stab at that?
I will, in the sense that I read the question, like when they said practical, I went real practical, like, you know, real basic resource availability on campuses. We still have support for graduate students in the Writing Center, for instance, even as, you know, folks in the STEM fields feel until they get to the thesis and dissertation that it was not an issue. So taking advantage of the resources that are on your campuses for success in courses. We have support for, I mean, it's through our counseling service, but it is a different kind of support than exclusively the one-on-one counseling, where we're helping students to identify those moments when ADHD is flaring, for instance. Like, how do you avoid falling into depression because you think that somehow you can't focus? And so real practical kind of retention programming that we try to roll out. And so those are some of the things that you might think about at the institutional level, but on a local department level, if you have a graduate student council in your department, I would think about getting involved in that way. And if not having one, then organizing one so that you can help faculty and departments understand what specific needs are there, especially when those, and this is where there are gaps. So we don't know what you don't tell us. And it's been 20 years, as we've said, at the earliest, since we've been students in the same way. So it helps when you say, as students, here's some of the things that we would really like to see more of. Things like, we had our graduate student council, for instance, talk about transparent pedagogies, which, unless you've come out in the last 5 years, you're really not thinking about setting up your syllabus such that an assignment is clear. This is the specific objective I'm asking you to meet. And this is the thinking behind, or the rationale behind, this particular assignment, so that you can succeed at that assignment. So really being active and engaged learners, there's just no substitute for it. And those are some, as I said, like really kind of practical, down and dirty, every class you can identify this. And what I'm also finding, I'll close on this, what I'm also finding is really using your best or gaining really solid social skills so that you know how to interact with your professors professionally, because we're finding that that's becoming problematic, like the kind of casual, informal exchanges and emails, or I'm not going to your office hours because I'm in my room. Like, success in courses is like what we used to call like good home training and common sense, but we have to speak those things now a little bit differently. Where you're literally figuring out, like, how do I establish a mentor relationship? How do I, what does the office hour exchange look like, so that I'm not asking a person to just explain something to me, instead of saying, here's where I keep getting stuck. like unstick me here, as opposed to just tell me how to do this, which comes off like, I don't want to work hard. I just want the answer.
Thank you very much. Our next question from our students is regarding current adversities due to COVID-19. How effectively do you think you or your institution has prepared students to advance their careers?
Well, I'll jump in to start. And I will clearly say that the pandemic was not wished upon by anyone. By the mere fact that we pivoted from a majority face-to-face environment, classroom environment, literally overnight, to a virtual classroom environment is some elements of success. I do think the jury is still out because we haven't captured data on how well students are learning, have learned in this environment. We've learned at Morgan State that there has been sort of a varied experience in which our faculty members have prepared themselves to engage in the online world. We've had some that are fully engaged where their courses are rich with content, their engagement is dynamic. And then we've had, unfortunately, some faculty members that have struggled to bring themselves up to that virtual sort of engagement. So I don't think we can really say, in my mind, it's so difficult to say how well we prepared because we really haven't looked at the data yet to make any conclusive discussion yet.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take that question?
I'll build off of what Oscar said. I mean, I think he's right. It is too soon, but I think that one of the things that I've tried to do is just by the sheer fact of talking about resilience and being able to pivot and being able to, I think we as a people got very comfortable. You get up at 8, you go to work, you go home, you do this, you do that. Everything was real normal. We got in a routine. There's no more routines. And so we're coming back to a sense of routine. But I think for this generation of students, the big takeaway for me is be pivotable, if that's even a word. I think my generation, Clay generation, we kind of knew you ebbed and flowed. You kind of went like this. But I think this next generation has been sort of just real linear. And I think the pandemic sort of knocked you into you got to be more fluid. You got to sort of take things as they come and go. You got to learn how to pivot. And so I think while it's not necessarily perhaps in the classroom preparation, there's a lot of takeaways. And so I know as I talk to students, I try to reiterate that. Don't see it all as being totally uncomfortable. Be comfortable with the uncomfortable because life is going to continue to knock you around a whole lot and it's not going to be real linear. So that's how I've tried to put what we would call a co-curricular flavor around the pandemic.
Thank you.
I was thinking about those pandemic pivots that you just mentioned, Dr. Adams. Dr. Barton was talking about when you find out you have faculty who are struggling. So what we had to put in place for those faculty who identified as struggling was some immediate help, something that would make them feel more secure, and also some PD that they could get immediately from our JSU online office or a division rather, and also from teachers who were not struggling, who were actually soaring, to share, strategies with them with, that was peer sharing. And so it helped a lot of people immediately. And then over a few weeks, people were able to change some things and they weren't struggling as much. And even in one other situation, and I know that we said that the jury is still out on whether or not we've been successful on some of these things, even looking at the fact that some students in science, engineering, and technology could not get the lab time that they needed to complete culminating projects and theses and so forth, that we had to find alternatives for them that would work. And we had to also make sure that we were finding alternatives that would not decrease the rigor, and so that they would be prepared for the next level. So all of that, like you say, we'll find out if we were successful or not pretty soon.
Thank you very much. Our next question is, how do we get research institutions that are not MSIs to look at doctoral students from MSIs as faculty candidates? The comment goes on to say that most faculty recruiting is concentrated to a group of primarily PWIs.
That's a great question. And I have two kind of anecdotes to go along with them. The first one, Preselfannie may remember this, but I can remember being told that when I interviewed at LSU, somebody's response was, yeah, she's great. She did a great job with all of her materials. I mean, she's got a Ford postdoc, but her degree is from Howard. Now, mind you, I'm going to teach in African-American literature, and it's the only department with like 5 or 6 faculty in African-American literature in the country. Nobody else is better trained. But it was the school, like, but how can we hire someone from this school? So I have like a personal experience with it. But then the second thing is our president is very deliberate at Howard, is very deliberate about diversifying searches. So he will say a search has failed if a candidate, if the short list comes back and there's not a diverse pool, if there's not a woman on that list, if there's not a person who represents whatever that minority is for that particular school or college, for instance. So I think you have to be very intentional. Deans have to be very intentional. Provosts have to be very intentional. Presidents have to be very intentional to say, if there is not a person who has some experience with whether undergraduate teaching or a PhD earned from an MSI, then the search has failed. Because that goes back to that thing, or are we reproducing ourselves? Like, how are we trying to sustain white supremacy, and how are we trying to maintain homogeneity? And you have to be very just deliberate. Like, it fails if it doesn't, if you aren't taking that into consideration. And you can also just educate your colleagues about what it means to come from those schools. And I think Stephanie was mentioning a little bit earlier, and I know we've all seen the statistics, but the number of the undergraduate institution for students who go on to earn PhDs who are African-American is like 70 to 80% HBCU. So we know what we're doing. So you have to be able to communicate to people that there is not a stigma associated, a negative stigma associated with a degree coming from that place, but rather this is a benefit, this is an attribute. You're going to get certain characteristics out of this person, including a commitment to mission and teaching and flexibility and agility, soft skills and hard skills. You won't find better candidates. So a lot of it comes with educating people too about what those schools are, what they do, their history, their levels of success, and so on.
So I'll add, I think I don't disagree with anything Dana said. I think there's 2 pieces to it though, because sometimes it's where you're sitting. So I think about when I was an assistant professor at Nebraska, and I was in industrial engineering. And so the way we admitted graduate students was there was a folder put together about each candidate, and every faculty member read the candidate's materials and checked yes or no, they should be admitted and they'd get funded. So now at that time, there's only 2 places in the country you could get an industrial engineering degree from an HBCU. One was Morgan State and one was A&T. So this particular student happened to be from Morgan State. And the faculty are like, well, we don't know that school. And so then I shared the statistic that I just shared about the only 2 places you could get it. Now I'm an assistant professor, but I felt that I could speak up and I could educate, as Dana said. But then I went on to say, well, but I don't know all these schools in India and China that y'all are admitting students from either. So we owe it to each other to educate ourselves about all types of institutions. So I offer that because I was not in a leadership role. I was an assistant professor where you sort of taught, keep your mouth shut around these things. But when we had faculty searches, I could make sure that my vast network knew about positions. And so when I was the first African-American faculty member hired at Nebraska in industrial engineering. By the time the next guy came along, it was almost, pretty like, oh yeah, run of the mill, let's, do these different kinds of things. So I think you have to speak up. Now, as leaders, and all of us on this panel are leaders, as Dana said, as a dean, I question everybody's diversity in your search. but I also have a responsibility to educate and help my department heads and the faculty understand the demographics, understand some of the challenges. So in 2019, the country only produced 200 African-American PhDs in engineering, and there are 350 ABET accredited schools. We know that half the people that get PhDs don't go into the academy. So now you're saying there's 100 people for 350 schools. So what I now say to my people is, if you want to diversify your faculty, you can get a Black person every 3 years. So if you see one that comes along now, you better do something different. With the Hispanic number, it's actually turning around. It's changed a little. Well, it's a little bit about 25% for African Americans, about 33% for Hispanic. So you get a third of a Hispanic person every 3 years, and a fourth of a Black person every 3 years, right? So I'm like, if you come across one, you better try to do something different. And if you don't have any, I'm going to kick your search back. So it takes both sides of it, where you have to lead from whatever place you are, but you have to do it in a respectable way that folks can receive it. So if I'm the lowest person on the totem pole, or I'm the top person on the pole, I still can contribute to sort of shift the middle. And that was probably politically incorrect for me to use the poll. So we're recording this. Can we bleep that part out? Because my Native colleagues would not be happy with me at this point. I'm sorry. I caught myself afterwards. So I have to apologize when I'm wrong.
I appreciate your saying this. And for a little bit of levity, I thought you were on the other pole. So yeah, either way, it doesn't work. Yeah, we'll take it back.
The next question is, what should we do to deal with some teachers in our middle and high schools that believe and sustain systems that do not teach or prepare our Black minority students for higher level mathematics and sciences?
Gonna pass. I think my answer might be illegal.
I do think though it's the same thing about education. I mean, and part of it is educating the person who is the teacher. So if you, and I would say this, whether it is the classroom that you're in front of or kids, and this is why, you know, certain projects like 1619 and the Lincoln Project are like so important for different reasons, because you have to educate people at a national level, but also at a local level about who built pyramids, for instance. So if you bring them again, all the way from kind of classical Africa to the contemporary moment, then it's not an issue to say these minority students aren't academically inclined towards these fields. And when we reiterate that as a stereotype, then it becomes self-fulfilling. Like, well, don't worry about it. You know, you're not going to do well in science and math. You really don't. And I mean, this is like the opposite end of the extreme, but we have just seen recently where the NFL was continuing to use a different IQ standard and so on for like how Black players are identified in terms of intellect. Mm-hmm. So you have to disabuse people of those notions about genetics. I mean, it's I don't know that I'm trying to say that it's a soft eugenics, but I don't even know that it's soft. It's eugenics. So we have to like really educate people to say middle school and high school students, and especially teachers, and I would even go below that and say elementary school teachers have to show images and give examples of how Black people historically over the years, from the earliest of civilizations, have been involved in all disciplines. And I would even go so far as to suggest that they can't disaggregate these disciplines, because you don't want to even build the pyramid if you don't have the humanities imagination to think about practicality and beauty at the same time. There's that perfection element that's like so endemic to African cultures.
Yeah, and Dana, you're right on point. I think that the stereotypes and the identity politics are so destructive. We've got to get away from this, because somehow we are losing the potential and opportunities for a group of students who could be the next Einstein. Just because you see that it is a Black female or a Black male. And if you didn't see that person from that identity perspective, you would have no stereotype about their performance. I mean, look at what is going on in the music industry when we look at auditions. First, there were blind auditions where the candidate would walk behind a screen and perform their ballot, and that person, whether female or male, will be selected. Well, then it became so scrutinized where the females would have to take off their high heel shoes so that the judge would not hear them tapping on the stage. Any little thing can be used as a justifier to say, hey, I got you. This is not for you. So you're right. We got to get away from these stereotypes. We got to get away from these identity politics.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is about deans. So how can deans make a positive impact on increasing the representation of minorities in engineering?
So let me start, Stephanie, and I think image is everything. And Stephanie, as everyone knows, was past president of ASWE. But let me just share some statistics with you how things are quickly changing. And my colleague, Greg Washington, now the president of George Mason, shared some ideas with me, so I'll share with you today. To reach 50 million users in this country, it took 38 years from to gain 38 years to have a television to get 50 million users. It took 13 years for 50 million users to have the access to a cell phone. 7 years for 50 million users to start regularly using the internet. Only 4 years for 50 million users to gain access to Facebook. And it only took 3 weeks for 50 million users to use Pokemon Go. Now, I had to tell my provost that I was not among those 50 million users in the Pokemon Go thing. So she was comfortable with that. What I'm just trying to frame is that technology is changing so rapidly that what we in academia have to do is recognize the difference in timescales. We move at a much more glacial pace. Technology and industry is moving at a much more exponential pace. Here's some statistics from the World Economics Forum. They surveyed by 2021 the adoption of technologies. And these technologies are not anything traditional we hear in terms of our stovepipe disciplines, other than some of our multidisciplinary disciplines. Cloud computing, Internet of Things, encryption, cybersecurity, AI, robotics, distributed ledger technology or blockchain, 3D printing, power storage, new materials, biotechnology, robotic and quantum computing. All of these are going to pervade the industries of the future, industries of now and the industries of the future. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, some of the engineering disciplines didn't exist. 50 years ago, some of our engineering, 50 years future, some of our engineering disciplines will no longer be there as well. But these industries, agriculture, auto, education, financial services, manufacturing, transportation, have all adopted for these technologies. So what I'm suggesting here is that somehow, in order for us to start increasing the number of African Americans, underrepresented groups in engineering, we need to align ourselves, continue to align ourselves with what is going on in industry, generate programs that are going to be number one, interesting, number one, grab the attention of our industry partners, and maintain that cutting edge kind of perspective. We at Morgan State just created a mechatronics engineering program. There's a whole story behind that. So mechatronics engineering is the synergy behind electrical and mechanical systems. We were forced to be creative based upon some other issues in the state, but that's how we decided to become and offer a flagship program. Now it's going to start this fall, and we really think that this is going to be one that will capture students' attention in the future. And I'll let Stephanie jump in there before I take up all the time.
Thank you, Oscar. I break it down real simple. First, deans have to stop being silent. And so, you know, if you're going to be a dean, speak up. If you can't just go in the dean's meeting where all the other deans are and go, yeah, diversity is important when we're in Washington. And when we get back to our campus, we don't say anything. So we have to speak up. Second of all, just because you talk about it doesn't mean things change. And oftentimes people say, well, I don't know what to do. Then go find somebody who knows what to do. There's people out there who know how to help you help your own institution. So you got to take some action and get some help. We have to push back when our faculty say, well, we can't find any. Well, where'd you look?
Yes.
You know, we got to push back. Now, I gave you the statistic, and I told you it's 200 African-American PhDs. It's about 275-ish or so Hispanic PhDs. So it's not a whole lot, but there are people out there. So our job is to go and find them. And then we can't be apologetic about the fact that we talk about it. I talk every time my people hear from me, they hear something about diversity. Now, diversity is broader than just brown and black people. So I'm always inclusive. I end every presentation with thank you in all kind of languages, little things that I can do that show that I am open and accessible and available to have a conversation about it, I think begins to change it. And so now, in the 2 years that I've been here, I hear other people talking about diversity. They don't always know what to do, but they talk about diversity. The last thing I'll say is the quote from Gandhi that we all overuse, which is be the change you want to see in the world. That's the part that we overuse. The underused part is what Gandhi said in the next sentence. And what he said was, if you can't be the change you want to see, get out of the way, or give the resources to help somebody else be the change. So again, if you're a dean and you don't know, get out of the way, but put up some resources so somebody who does know what to do can do it. And we're not always doing this on a shoestring budget. And thus far, diversity has always been kind of a shoestring budget kind of, it's the first thing that gets cut in the budget cuts. We're going to cut the diversity position. No, that's the last thing I'm cutting, right? We're going to cut something else. So that's my 2 cents.
Well said.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Adams, for those comments. And thank you, all the deans, for this wonderful panel. I thank you for engaging in this meaningful discussion here today.